first things told Miss Christine Wells in the first phone call that ever occurred with anything to do with Nolan Wells being gone, because I was the first person to call Miss Christine about anything.
Oh, these little liars. I told y'all. Let's start with Warren's first phone call.
Two statements made by the same person, less than an hour apart, appear to describe the same problem in completely different ways. Warren Hudson told investigators that reaching his mother from Horn Island could be difficult because of unreliable cell service.
Either her service was bad because she was on the back side of the aisle, on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
But earlier in that same interview, while explaining how he had tried to contact her, he described making repeated calls until she finally answered.
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up.
On its own, that difference does not prove what happened. Cell coverage can vary by location, and a single failed call does not necessarily mean a phone is completely without service. But in a case where the timeline depends heavily on who could reach whom, when they could reach them, and what they knew at each moment, even small differences can become important. And this case contains a much larger question. Nolan Wells was 18 when he went out on the water over the 4th of July weekend and failed to return home. In the hours that followed, his phone remained active on Life 360, while the people around him began giving accounts of when they realized he was missing, where his phone was, and how authorities were contacted. Those accounts are now part of the public record. The challenge is separating what has been independently documented from what was remembered later, what was misunderstood, and what remains unresolved. That is where this investigation begins. The first critical issue is Nolan's phone. According to Warren's account, he was the first person to contact Nolan's mother, Christine Wells, after the group realized Nolan was missing. Warren emphasized that point repeatedly, making clear that he wanted his role in that first communication understood. But Christine Wells has publicly described the same conversation differently in one important respect. Her account indicates that Life 360 showed Nolan's phone on land, and that Warren then acknowledged that the group had the phone.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, well, we have his phone.
That distinction matters because Life 360 was providing information about the phone's location at a moment when Nolan himself could not be located. If the phone was with the group, its location was potentially one of the few immediate clues available to the family. So the question is not simply whether Warren contacted Christine first. The question is, what information was communicated during that first conversation, and exactly when the physical location of Nolan's phone became known? That question leads directly to another part of the timeline, the Coast Guard. Warren said he knew someone connected to the Coast Guard and intended to contact them. That is different from saying that he had already placed an official emergency call through the Coast Guard system. Public information about the case later included references to an earlier communication and a formal Coast Guard response around 12:30 a.m. The precise relationship between those communications is important because the difference between a personal contact and an official distress call can affect how the early timeline is understood. And that timeline matters because the hours immediately after Nolan disappeared were already becoming complicated. The phone was being tracked. Family members were trying to determine where Nolan was. Questions were being raised about the boats, and according to accounts discussed publicly, a confrontation eventually developed at a house where members of the group had gathered. At some point, people connected to Nolan's family arrived looking for his phone. Later accounts described a group of roughly 10 to 15 people becoming confrontational and demanding information about the phone and the location of a boat. Those accounts need to be treated carefully. They are descriptions provided by people involved in the events, not independent proof of every detail, but they establish something important about the atmosphere that night. This was no longer simply a family waiting for a teenager to come home. People were actively trying to trace his movements, and the phone appeared to be moving without Nolan. That is where the case begins to shift from a missing person mystery into a question of timeline reconstruction. Because if Nolan was believed to be somewhere on or near the water, yet his phone was showing up on land, investigators had to determine who possessed it, where it traveled, and when. The answers would depend on more than interviews. They would depend on phone records, location data, emergency communications, photographs, video, and the recollections of the people who were there. And when those sources do not immediately align, the gaps become significant. Before we go further, if you're following this case for the first time, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This channel focuses on true crime investigations by examining the available evidence carefully and separating documented facts from unanswered questions. Because in Nolan Wells' case, the most important clues may not be found in one dramatic discovery. They may be hidden in the minutes between phone calls, the movements recorded by a tracking app, and the differences between what people said at one point and what they said later. And that brings us back to the first contradiction.
Oh, these little liars. I told y'all that Jax was the ringleader. I told y'all. He sat in this interview and he was telling stories about shit that he wasn't even there to witness. So let's break down some of the stuff that I heard in this interview. Let's start with Warren's first phone call, because y'all will remember that Warren said that he was over at Ava's house for that 4th of July party when they all started realizing that Nolan was missing, and he called Miss Christine at 11 o'clock.
One of the first things I told Miss Christine Wells in the first phone call that ever occurred with anything to do with Nolan Wells being gone, because I was the first person to call Miss Christine about anything. First phone call, anything to do with Nolan Wells, was me making a phone call to Christine Wells. And one of the first things I said to her, with multiple witnesses here, pull up the phone call if you want. She said, oh, well, Nolan's location is with y'all at, where the house we were at. And I was like, well, no, he left his phone with us. I told her this.
And yesterday, the same time that this interview came out, Christine Wells said this.
360 says that he's on land, and he was like, well, no, I mean, well, we have his phone.
So both versions of the story say that Warren didn't tell her about the phone until after she confronted him with the 360. Now, Warren tells Miss Christine that he knows somebody in the Coast Guard and that he's going to call them, which is very fucking different than calling the Coast Guard, which absolutely explains why the Coast Guard came out and said at first that they had not received a call from the kids that night. The Coast Guard's initial statement said they weren't informed until 12:30. Then the Coast Guard later changed their story and said, oh wait, actually we did. And it seems to me that that first call was most likely an off-the-record to a friend kind of deal, which means these people freaked out and didn't call the Coast Guard until after all these people showed up at Jax's house. Which would explain why in the course of this interview it went from Warren called the Coast Guard to we did. Now, when the subject turns to how the family got the phone back from these boys, you'll notice that there was a couple slip-ups.
Warren, you weren't at the house, and so you weren't there when they came to get the phone and all that. So
now remember, Warren just said that he wasn't at the house when the phone was got. And then Morgan talks about getting a phone call from one of the people in Christine Wells' group.
And how did they get the phone back?
So I got a call from a kid we went to high school with. He called me just asking me questions. He saw people posting on Snapchat, like the picture that was circulating.
Except this picture wasn't posted until July 5th. So how could this picture have been circulating on Snapchat that night? But let's continue.
And he called and he was asking questions. He was like, where's Nolan? When's the last time y'all seen him? And then he was like, so where are y'all at? And I told him, I said, we're at Jax's house. And then Warren got on the phone, and I don't know. So they come to my house, right? And they kind of
hold on, before we get there. Was it confrontational, or was it just just trying to find? It was confrontational.
Yeah,
already?
Wouldn't y'all agree? Yeah, he was 110%. He was very confrontational.
And when did was this on the night of the 4th or the next day?
This was the night when this was before they came and got the phone.
So this is the night of the 4th, yes.
You guys are missing a part of the story. How did you get from Ava's house to Jax's house? Because Miss Christine is watching you guys on the Life 360, so suddenly she's seeing the phone leave one location and go to another. Of course I would be upset. And now all of a sudden Warren is there when the phone stuff starts happening? He's listening to the phone call? Now I need y'all to remember that Warren also said that the phone was in his truck on the first conversation, as we have from this report. Meaning if we were to believe Warren that he was not there when everybody showed up looking for the phone at some time in between 11 and 1 a.m., so then that would mean after they heard this angry phone call, Warren gets the phone out of his vehicle and puts it in Jack's house and then leaves.
There's probably like 10, 15 people in my house I don't even know. And they're all up in our faces, going crazy, asking where Nolan is, and we don't know. And finally they get into Wyatt's face, and they're like, where's your boat? Where's the boat at? demanding his address and stuff like that. And he finally ends up giving it to him.
We give them the phone. They have the phone at this point. Then they get the address to his house. Then they go to his house. And they're searching all over his boat, what I heard and stuff like that. Well, anyways, I don't really know much about that, but they come back to my house at around 1 o'clock in the morning. We called law enforcement. I was with Wyatt at the time. After we left Jax's house that night, I was with Wyatt, and one person we were with saw that their location was headed towards Wyatt's house. And so Wyatt got on the phone with 911 and was like, hey, these people are on the way to my house or already at my house. My mom and my dad are there alone, and they know nothing about this. But Wyatt's mom actually, when they were looking at the boat, they were actually walking from the boat, and she came out and started talking to them.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Wyatt, Morgan, and Jax were all together. Warren was gone for some reason at this point. 10 to 15 people just barge into your house. Don't know why your grandparents weren't around. That might explain some things, huh? Guess y'all had the house all to your fucking self that weekend. But then they ask Wyatt for his address so that they can go look at the boat. Wyatt gives them the address. They start heading over there. Wyatt and Morgan get into a car and leave Jax's house. Somebody else that you were with that we aren't hearing about is tracking someone else's phone. I don't know if it was somebody who was with the group that they had access to, or if they were tracking Nolan's phone and they saw it was heading to Wyatt's house. And even though Wyatt gave them the address, and instead of calling his parents, he calls 911 and tells them, my parents don't know anything about that's going on. Can you send police over there? Now, mind you, it was about half an hour after being on the phone with Warren that Christine was able to actually call and report him missing. But she was having to go back and forth and go down to all these different agencies because nobody would fucking help her. And frankly, I want to know why all of this confrontation was left out of the fucking report. Like, if this family had to be removed from 2 different properties by the police, why is there no record of that? And in fact, it wasn't until after these confrontations that MDMR and Ocean Springs Police apparently had their little conversations about who was going to be taking over the case. Because remember, the Jackson County Sheriff Lieutenant told them that deputies had spoken with several friends that had traveled to the island on the vessel with Nolan, and that when they were left, he was in the company of an unknown female. So now, even though Warren had supposedly called the Coast Guard, all these family members are telling the police that the kid is missing. These are the people that last saw them. They're all like, we last saw him on the island. Still, the deputies said that they did not have reason to believe that there was any water-related exigencies or emergencies. Don't worry, y'all. I've got a lot fucking more to say about this stuff, so come back for part 2. I'm going to be immediately recording it because Warren fucked up pretty badly in this interview, and I'll show you why. Where we had left off, Warren had already called Miss Christine, and then they somehow ended up at Jax's grandparents' house. That's where they all stayed that weekend, and so that's why Nolan's keys were over there. They had to have been at the grandparents' house, who mysteriously never showed up during any of these confrontations. Somehow the phone had gone from the party that they were all at to Jax's place, and then Warren left after a phone call to Morgan. According to them, 10 to 15 people showed up and just walked into Jax's house and demanded the phone. Wyatt gave the address in which the boat was at. They all start migrating over there. Then Morgan and Wyatt and another friend are tracking their 360s and seeing that they're going over to Wyatt's house. Then they call 911 to tell them that the police are on the way to his house. Then they're searching the boat, and then they come back to Jax's house around 1 o'clock in the morning, according to him. Mind you, that's when they explain to the police about their friend being missing. And so then the report says at 1:38 in the morning, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office say that they spoke to several of the friends that were on the vessel with Nolan, saying that he was in the company of an unknown female. But Morgan, Jax, and Warren all claimed that they did not travel to the island on the same boat as Nolan. So who did they talk to? Because it sounds to me like they had told the police that they were on the same boat as him. Keeping in mind that this is what Warren told Miss Christine.
Named Katie. And so then it turned into, Katie is also missing. No one can find her. And the explanation of no one knows this Katie, like we've never met her.
And Tristan said this.
I was talking on my other buddy's phone, talking to Warren. He was dialing Coast Guard because he hung up the phone and was like, hey, this is them, but and hung with the phone. And that was the last time I talked to him.
Mind you, Trayston is friends with Katie. They are mutuals. I have confirmed this. So now that we've got that timeline fucking straight, let's back up to something that Warren said during this interview.
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up because either her service was bad because she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
Do y'all see that? Let me play it again slower for you.
Either her service was bad because she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
Oh no. Not only did Warren confirm that his mom was on the south side of the island, but Warren himself said that if you're motivated enough, you can call somebody. I tried calling my mom 8 times. Yet this is what he said last time.
A little off the island, you have cell coverage. And even on the island, like I called my mom when we were on the island, it was fine.
So which is it? Did you call your mom with ease, or did you try to call her 8 times because you were motivated to get in touch with her? But Warren wasn't the only one to slip up, because listen.
And he's on the phone with Cito, and he's trying to get them on the phone. And as he stated in the moment, he's like, Cito's just asking all these dumb questions. I can't figure out what's going on. And so finally hangs up. And after the trim to the motor started to work again. So they manually trim it down by the buttons on the motor, trimmed it down, and some electronics started to come back on. And they got the boat to crank over, and they're like, all right, unties.
So first off, Jax just proved that the boys put the phone on mute during the call with Cito, because I've listened to the entire 8-minute call, and at no point does they ever say anything about them asking all these stupid questions. Then he said after they hung up on the Cito, that's when it started working again, and they said, okay, untie us, implying that it had been tied up to the other boat the entire time. But we see in this video that they are hauling the line back in right here as he's on the phone. See, you can see right here where the line is being pulled in from across the way where the boat is stationed. Meaning he had already hung up with Cito at that point, and he had to have been on the phone with someone else. And what we see here is, once again, we have an interview where they go into so much detail about stuff that doesn't fucking matter.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and first off explain a boat.
We fucking get how a bilge pump works. We get it by now. Stop fucking talking about the bilge pump. What we actually want to hear about is the multiple stops that were made before ending up back at the grandparents' house before they even took the boat to the boat dock. We want you guys to explain how the Cito was canceled by the grandfather on the captain's private line before you guys had even hung up with Cito. That's why nobody believes a fucking word that you are saying. Because I showed y'all yesterday how AI had clearly doctored these photos. If you missed it, look, silver pole. Look, no silver pole. It's actually white. And if you look at this picture in the grandparents' driveway of the Triton, you will see that the little handrails are not leaning over. You will see that the rails are going straight up and down and not leaning, which is why I also suspect that the identity of whoever this is was intentionally covered up. Because first off, who wears this weird swimsuit thing? This is somebody who, if they were with them, would have stood out in a crowd. But this woman who's in a red striped swimsuit with a white baseball cap shows up in a lot of different pictures, just oh so obscured. Here she is again, handing out beers on Bart's boat. So I personally suspect that whoever that was in fact on the Triton, and they used AI to change her clothing and to obscure her identity. Because I think this was either Warren's mother or Wyatt's stepmother, which would explain the older female voice people have said they've heard on the Cito. Because otherwise, why would he need to call his mother 8 times? Unless, according to his own words,
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah.
Because remember, there is a 4th boat out there. 1, 2, 3, and 4. I just accidentally stumbled onto something that literally is concrete proof.
If cell service was truly unreliable on Horn Island, how easily could someone have made contact? If reaching a family member required repeated attempts, what does that tell us about the reliability of other communications that night? And if Nolan's phone was already in the possession of people on land while his whereabouts remained unknown, who had it and why? Those questions do not establish what happened to Nolan, but they give us the starting point for reconstructing the night, minute by minute. And the next part of the timeline begins when Christine Wells looked at the location of her son's phone and realized that what she was seeing did not match what she had been led to believe. The phone had become the most immediate piece of information available to Nolan Wells' family. Life 360 was showing a location on land, while the people searching for Nolan were trying to understand how that could be possible if he was still believed to be somewhere around the water. And then the phone moved. According to the accounts presented publicly, Nolan's phone had been at the house where the 4th of July gathering took place, before appearing at another location associated with Jackson's grandparents. From there, its movements became part of the growing confrontation between the people searching for Nolan and the young men who had been with him. Warren's account places him as the person who first contacted Christine Wells. He emphasized that point repeatedly, making clear that he wanted his role in that first communication understood. But the more important question was what happened after that call. According to the later accounts, people connected to Nolan's family eventually arrived at the house where several members of the group were gathered. They were looking for the phone and demanding answers about where Nolan had gone. The accounts described the encounter as confrontational. At some point, Wyatt was asked where his boat was located. He provided the address, and the group then headed toward the property where the boat was kept. That movement created another layer in the timeline, because, according to the accounts being examined, Warren was no longer with the group when some of these events unfolded. Yet his own earlier description had placed Nolan's phone in his possession or within the group's control. So the question becomes straightforward, even if the answer is not. Who physically moved the phone from one location to another? The answer cannot simply be assumed from the interviews. It has to be compared against the Life 360 records, phone data, witness accounts, and any available video or other documentation. That distinction is crucial. A location history can show where a device traveled. It does not automatically tell us who was carrying it. Likewise, a witness can remember who was present, but a memory given hours or days later may not capture every movement accurately. That is why the sequence matters more than any individual statement. The people searching for Nolan eventually went toward the location of Wyatt's boat. According to the accounts, Wyatt and another member of the group became concerned that the people looking for the phone were also heading toward his home, where his parents were present. Wyatt contacted 911. Again, the reason for that call is important to understand in context. The account describes it as a request for law enforcement because people were approaching his property, rather than simply being an emergency call reporting Nolan missing. That distinction does not tell us anything about Nolan's fate, but it tells us what the people involved were focused on at that particular moment. The phone, the property, the boat, and the approaching group had suddenly become immediate concerns. Meanwhile, the search for Nolan was continuing. Eventually, law enforcement became involved at the property where the boat was located. Accounts indicate that the boat was examined and that people connected to Nolan's disappearance spoke with deputies. And this is where another discrepancy enters the public record. A later account attributed to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office indicated that deputies spoke with several friends who had traveled to the island with Nolan, and that Nolan had reportedly been left in the company of an unidentified female. That statement becomes difficult to reconcile with later public accounts from Warren, Morgan, and Jackson, who said they had not traveled to the island on the same boat as Nolan. If those statements are all accurate, as presented, then an important question remains. Who gave deputies the information about Nolan being with an unknown woman? The available material does not provide a definitive answer, and that is precisely why it should not be filled in with speculation. The identity of the person who provided that information, the circumstances in which it was given, and how it was documented are all relevant to reconstructing the timeline. There is another issue surrounding the phone. One account described a photograph appearing to circulate on Snapchat during the night Nolan disappeared. But the photograph being discussed was reportedly posted publicly on July 5th. That creates a timestamp problem. It does not necessarily mean that anyone was lying. The image could have existed privately before being posted publicly. Someone could have received it directly, or the speaker could have been combining events from different points in time. Only the original message records, metadata, or other contemporaneous evidence could establish what actually happened. And that is precisely the kind of question that can potentially be answered through original records, rather than recollection. The same principle applies to the Coast Guard communication. The young men later described an emergency involving the boat, including mechanical problems and a call for assistance. One account described frustration with the Coast Guard operator's questions and suggested that the call was eventually ended because the questions were not helping the situation. But an examination of the publicly discussed recording did not appear to contain the same exchange in the way it was later characterized. That does not establish that the account was false. It could mean the speaker was referring to another communication, remembered the conversation differently, or summarized the experience rather than quoting it precisely. But if the complete recording exists, then the recording is the stronger source. And the recording is especially important because it may help establish what the people on the boat were experiencing at that exact moment. The boat had reportedly experienced mechanical problems. The group contacted the Coast Guard. There was another vessel nearby, and at some point, the boats were connected. The sequence of those events matters. Video footage discussed publicly appears to show a line being pulled in during the Coast Guard communication. That observation potentially differs from the later verbal description that the boat was untied after the call ended. Again, the correct response is not to declare which account is true based on a short video. The correct response is to compare the footage with the full recording, timestamps, GPS information, and any available Coast Guard documentation. Because if another vessel was physically connected to the boat during the emergency, then the people aboard that vessel could potentially be important witnesses. Who was there? When did the vessels connect? When did they separate? What did the people on each boat see? And where was Nolan during that sequence? Those questions become even more important when the case is viewed alongside the phone's movements. A device can move without its owner. A person can make a phone call without creating a complete record of everything happening around them. A witness can remember an event differently months later. But independent records can sometimes establish the order in which those things happened. That is why the phone remains so important. The location data does not tell us what happened to Nolan. It tells us where the device associated with him was. And if Nolan was not carrying that device, then every movement recorded after he disappeared has to be understood in that context. At the same time, the family was trying to get law enforcement to treat Nolan as missing. According to the publicly described timeline, Christine Wells encountered difficulties getting assistance and had to communicate with different agencies before the situation was formally addressed. Later information from law enforcement indicated that deputies had spoken with people connected to Nolan and initially did not identify evidence of a water-related emergency. That is significant because, by this point, multiple versions of the night's events were already circulating. The family believed Nolan was missing. The phone was on land. The people who had been with Nolan were giving accounts of what they believed had happened. And law enforcement was trying to determine whether the circumstances constituted a missing person case, a boating emergency, or something else entirely. Those categories matter because each one can shape how the first hours of an investigation unfold. And the first hours are often the most important. Evidence can move. Phones can change locations. Memories can become less precise. Photographs can be shared or deleted. And people who were together during an event can begin remembering the same sequence differently. That is why reconstructing the early timeline is so important in this case. The next question concerns the boats. Publicly discussed photographs appear to show multiple vessels in the area, including the Triton and another boat. An unidentified woman also appears in some of the photographs, including images in which she is wearing a red-striped swimsuit and a white baseball cap. Her identity has not been independently established from the available images. That point is critical. It would be irresponsible to identify her as a particular person's mother, stepmother, friend, or passenger, simply because her appearance seems familiar. The photographs alone do not establish where she was at every moment, which vessel she occupied, or what she may have witnessed. But her presence is still worth examining if investigators can independently establish who she was and where she was that night. The same caution applies to questions about the photographs themselves. Some viewers have argued that certain images appear to have been altered, or that details such as railings and other objects look different between photographs. Those observations may justify closer forensic examination. They do not, by themselves, prove that an image was intentionally manipulated. To establish that, investigators would need the original files, metadata, editing history where available, and appropriate forensic analysis. The same standard should apply to the audio. If listeners believe they hear an additional voice in the background of a Coast Guard recording, that should be analyzed by a qualified audio forensic specialist, rather than identified through casual listening. An apparent voice is not automatically an identified speaker. A sound that resembles a word is not automatically a confirmed statement. And a photograph that appears different from another photograph is not automatically proof of alteration. The evidence has to carry the conclusion. That is especially important in a case that has attracted intense online attention. Because once a theory takes hold, every ambiguous detail can begin to look like confirmation. The responsible approach is the opposite. Start with what can be established. Then identify what is inconsistent. Then determine what evidence could resolve the inconsistency. In Nolan Wells' case, that means going back to the records. The phone records, the Life 360 history, the Coast Guard communications, the boat movements, the photographs, the witness accounts, and the exact times attached to each event. When those pieces are placed side by side, a much more precise picture may emerge. But before that picture can be trusted, one more part of the timeline needs to be examined. The fourth boat, the people connected to it, and the possibility that someone outside the main group may have witnessed something that could help explain what happened during those missing minutes. The fourth boat may be one of the most important unresolved pieces of the timeline, not because its presence proves anything about Nolan Wells' disappearance, but because every additional vessel means additional people, additional movements, and potentially additional witnesses. The available material identifies more than one boat operating around the same period, yet the public accounts do not provide a complete, independently verified reconstruction of every vessel's movements. That leaves several basic questions unanswered. Who was aboard each boat? When did the boats meet? Which people were physically together at each point in the night? And, most importantly, when was Nolan last seen by someone who can independently account for his whereabouts? Those questions matter more than any online theory, because after examining the phone records, Life 360 information, interviews, photographs, and Coast Guard communication, one thing becomes clear. There are pieces of the timeline that can be described with reasonable confidence, and there are other pieces that remain uncertain. Nolan Wells went out on the water over the 4th of July weekend. At some point, he became separated from the people who had been with him. His phone remained in circulation after he was no longer believed to be with it. His family used Life 360 to track the device, and discovered that its location did not necessarily correspond with Nolan's actual whereabouts. Warren said he was the first person to contact Christine Wells. The group later became involved in confrontations surrounding the phone and the location of a boat. Law enforcement was eventually contacted. The Coast Guard became involved in communications concerning a boat experiencing problems, and investigators received information that Nolan had reportedly been left with an unidentified female. But the order and meaning of some of those events remain disputed. That distinction is important. A true crime documentary should not turn uncertainty into certainty simply because a theory makes for a more dramatic story. If the evidence does not establish something, it has to remain unresolved. Take the question of Nolan's phone. The Life 360 data can potentially establish where the device was, but unless there is independent evidence identifying the person carrying it, the data cannot automatically establish Nolan's physical location. That is why the movement of the phone is significant, but not conclusive. The same applies to Warren's statements about cell service. His comments appear inconsistent when placed side by side, but inconsistency alone does not establish why the statements differed. The explanation could involve changing locations, different attempts to call, imperfect recollection, or something else. The phone records are what could ultimately clarify that issue. The Coast Guard communications present a similar problem. There appears to have been more than one communication associated with the events that night, and later information from the Coast Guard provided additional context about an earlier contact. That means the initially reported timeline cannot simply be read as though the first publicly known emergency communication was necessarily the first attempt to obtain assistance. The distinction between an informal contact and an official emergency communication is important. So is the timing. If the records show that an earlier communication occurred before the formal response, that could explain part of the apparent discrepancy. But it still leaves questions about what information was provided during each contact. The recording itself may help answer some of those questions. So may the official logs. Then there is the boat. Accounts describe mechanical problems, communication with the Coast Guard, another vessel nearby, and a period during which the boats appear to have been connected. Video footage and later descriptions appear to place some of those events in different sequences. That does not automatically mean one version is false. It means the available material needs to be synchronized, the timestamps need to be checked, the footage needs to be compared with the recording, and the movements of the boats need to be compared with the GPS information. Only then can investigators determine whether the apparent contradiction is real or simply the result of people describing different moments. The same caution has to be applied to the unidentified woman. Photographs appear to show a woman wearing a red-striped swimsuit and a white baseball cap. She may be relevant to the timeline, but the available images do not independently establish her identity, which vessel she was aboard at a particular moment, or what she witnessed. Until that information is verified, she remains an unidentified person in the publicly available evidence. That may sound like a small detail. It isn't. Identifying someone incorrectly in a real investigation can damage reputations, contaminate public discussion, and potentially distract from the evidence that actually matters. The same principle applies to the claim that photographs were digitally altered. Visual differences between images can certainly justify forensic examination, but a difference in appearance is not itself proof of deliberate manipulation. The original files would matter. Metadata would matter. The editing history, if available, would matter. And an appropriate forensic examination would matter. Without those things, the responsible conclusion is simply that questions have been raised about the images. Nothing more. Audio requires the same discipline. If an additional voice appears to be audible on a recording, professional analysis can determine whether the sound is sufficiently clear for identification. But listeners should not treat an uncertain voice as a confirmed speaker. In a case this emotionally charged, the difference between "it sounds like" and "it has been forensically identified" is enormous. And that brings us back to the central question. What can actually be established? We can establish that Nolan's phone became a major source of information during the initial search. We can establish that Life 360 played a role in showing his phone on land. We can establish that members of the group gave accounts about the phone and their movements. We can establish that the Coast Guard became involved in communications connected to the boat. We can establish that law enforcement was eventually contacted and that deputies spoke with people connected to Nolan. And we can establish that public accounts contain differences that have not all been fully reconciled. What we cannot responsibly establish from the material presented here is exactly what happened to Nolan during every minute after he was last seen. We cannot identify an unknown woman simply from photographs. We cannot determine who was carrying the phone at every point without supporting evidence. We cannot conclude from a disputed photograph that someone intentionally altered evidence. And we cannot turn an apparent inconsistency in an interview into proof of wrongdoing without independent evidence supporting that conclusion. Those boundaries matter, because Nolan was not a fictional character. He was an 18-year-old whose family was trying to understand where he went and why he never came home. Behind every timestamp is a family waiting for an answer. Behind every photograph is a real person. And behind every unanswered question is the possibility that the evidence has not yet been fully understood. That is why the unresolved issues deserve attention. Who last saw Nolan? Who was with him? Where were the boats at that exact moment? Who had possession of his phone afterward? What do the complete phone records show? What do the original Life 360 records show? What does the Coast Guard's complete documentation establish about the sequence of communications? Who was aboard the additional vessel? Who was the unidentified woman? And can the statements given later be reconciled with the records created that night? Those are the questions that investigators and anyone seriously examining this case should continue to pursue. Not because every discrepancy means something sinister, but because discrepancies are precisely where a timeline can be tested. If an account is accurate, independent evidence should help support it. If a memory is mistaken, the records may reveal the correction. If two events have simply been placed in the wrong order, timestamps can put them back where they belong. And if something remains unexplained after every available source has been examined, then the honest answer is that it remains unexplained. That may not provide the dramatic ending people expect from a true crime documentary, but it is the difference between investigating a mystery and manufacturing one. The disappearance of Nolan Wells continues to matter because the central questions remain larger than any single internet theory. The evidence should determine the story, not the other way around. For now, the phone provides clues, but not a complete answer. The Coast Guard recordings provide a window into the night, but not every missing minute. The photographs provide images of people and boats, but not enough information to identify every person or establish every movement. And the interviews provide first-hand accounts, but those accounts contain differences that still need to be reconciled with independent records. Some of those questions may eventually be answered. Others may require evidence that has not yet become public. But until that happens, the most responsible position is also the simplest one. Follow the evidence. Separate what is confirmed from what is alleged. Do not mistake speculation for fact. And do not stop asking legitimate questions simply because the answers are difficult. Nolan Wells deserves more than a theory. His family deserves clarity. And if the remaining pieces of this timeline can be independently verified, they may eventually explain what happened during the hours that remain the most difficult to reconstruct. Until then, the mystery remains open, not because we know what happened, but because we still don't know enough to say that we do.